Hello and welcome. Today, we will discuss factoring in commercial banks. In this topic, we will go through 6 subtopics. Those are the definition, the participants, the procedures, the conditions, the price, and lastly, the methods. Let's start with the definition of factoring in commercial banks. Factoring is a form of credit extension to a goods seller or buyer through redeeming receivable or payable amounts arising from the purchase or sale of goods or provision of services under a sales contract on goods or service provision, while reserving the right to claim such amounts. Factoring as a package consists of 4 services. 1. Receivable tracking. Sellers are provided with the service of tracking all receivables. 2. Advance. Sellers might request a proportion of the receivables value transferred to the factor as an advance. 3. Receivable collection. Sellers could delegate the factors to collect payments from the buyers. 4. Default protection. Seller's receivables value is underwrote. In case of the buyer's defaults payment, factors will pay the sellers the receivables value. Relating to factoring, we have to mention factoring period. Factoring period is the duration, starting from the succeeding day of the day on which the first installment was advanced, to the day the client is obligated to pay debt and interests in full as agreed in the factoring agreement. Another descriptor related to factoring is repayment term. Repayment term is the periods of time in the contractual factoring period, of which at the end of each period, the client has to pay a part of debt, or interest of debt, and interest in full to the factor. That's for the definition part. Let's move to the next part, participants in factoring transaction. The first participant is the factor, or the factors. Factors are the parties permitted to provide factoring services. Factors can be banks, financial companies, factoring companies, etc. The second party is the seller. Seller is a party that sells goods and supplies services and has legitimate interests regarding amounts receivable as agreed upon in the contract of purchasing goods or services. The third one takes part in is the buyer, or purchaser. Purchaser purchases goods or using services and has payables as agreed upon in the contract of purchasing goods or services. Which benefits does each party receive from factoring services? Seller might receive an advance amount from factor, receive funds from banks without collaterals requirements, reduce the cost to track and collect receivables. Purchaser might purchase goods or services on credit, payment process is convenient. Commercial bank might diversify the service portfolio, increase the competitiveness, build up relationship with commercial banks abroad, collect information of customers. After knowing the participants, now, let us study the types and procedure of factoring. There are domestic factoring and international factoring. Domestic factoring means factoring based on sales contract under which the seller and purchaser are residents. In short, they come from the same country. International factoring means factoring based on sales contract between the exporter and importer under which either of them is a resident and the other is a non-resident. That said, they are from different countries. There are also factoring for seller and factoring for purchaser. Factoring for a seller means that the factor redeems with reservation of recourse a receivable of a client being the seller by making an advance payment for acquiring lawful rights and interests related to such receivable as agreed upon. Factoring for a purchaser means that the factor redeems with reservation of recourse are payable of a client being the purchaser, by making an advance payment to the seller, and is refunded by the client the advance payment, as well as interest and charge thereon as agreed upon. Regardless of the types of factoring procedure should be as follows. First, the seller and buyer conclude a contract for sale. Seller requests for factoring services. Second, factor assess the credit applicant and sign the factoring contract. Third, factor notifies to purchaser the factoring contract. Purchaser agrees to the terms and conditions of factoring contract. Next, seller transfers goods for purchaser and present shipping documents to factor to receive the advance. Then, factor makes an advance payment for seller and collect the receivables from purchaser. Lastly, factors pay the remaining of receivables for seller. Factoring service would be provided under several conditions. The client should be a legal person apply to residents, or an organization, as for non-residents. Has fully Civil Act capacity. Need factoring to lawfully use an advance payment, and serve production and business activities. Financially viable for debt payment. Has a feasible capital use plan. Receivables, payables should be arise from sales contract in accordance with law. Arise from sales contract whose remaining payment term under 181 days continuing from the date of receipt of the request of factoring. Receivables and payables may be transferred. Receivables and payables have not been used to secure other debt obligations. Have not become overdue for payment under sales contract. Are not involved in disputes. Now, let's move to the next part, price of factoring. The price of factoring is the income of factor when dealing the factoring services. The price of factoring is the different amount between the value of sales contract and the amount of money that factor pays for seller. That different amount consists of factoring interest and charges. Factoring interest is calculated on the advance payment the seller receiving, as follows. Factoring interest equals advance payment multiplied by factoring interest rate multiplied by factoring term. Whereas, factoring charges is calculated on the value of receivables or payables as follows. Factoring charge equals value of receivables or payables multiplied by percentage of commission fee. Factoring charges is factor's cost of risk management, operating fee, etc. Next, we'll have a look at factoring methods. Regarding factoring methods, there are several available offers. The first and simple one is single factoring. In single factoring, upon each factoring, the factor and client shall carry out factoring procedures and sign a factoring contract. The more complex one is limit-based factoring. In this method, the factor shall determine and reach agreement with the client on a maximum factoring debt limit to be maintained in a certain period and on the use of this limit. At least once every year, the factor shall consider determining the limit and its maintenance period. Another one is syndicated factoring, in which two or more factors jointly provide factoring for one or several receivable S or payable S of their clients, with one of them acting as the focal point in organizing syndicated factoring. Now, let's take an examples and some calculations to illustrate how factoring works. On the 5th of June, 2020, Company A signs a sales contract with Company B abroad as following. The commodity is crafts. The quantity is 50 pieces. The unit price €1,850 per piece. The payment method is payment by letter of credit 4 months after shipment. On the 4th of July, 2020, Company A request for factoring services at Bank X. Bank X agrees to providing factoring services to Company A. The detail of factoring contract is as following. Factoring interest rate is 13% a year. Advance payment is 85% of contract value. Factoring charges is 0.15% of value of contract value. Bank X pays the advance for Company A on the 10th of July, 2020. Company B agrees to make payment 100% of bill of exchange on the 28th of October, 2020. Calculate the advance payment of the factoring transaction. Calculate the amount that Company A receiving on the due date of the factoring contract.